Thank you for joining Jennifer Schultz and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email her directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. Right, just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis support to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. These are some upcoming events, so you can find more information here or on our website. We do offer advertising, so you can email this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, our speaker today is Anna Rose Stern, and she's going to be covering basics of a GAO bid protest. Anna, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join Basics of a GAO Bid Protest. Today we're going to focus on two main topics. The first will be a brief overview of the benefits of proactive protest planning. And in the second set of topics, we're going to go through examples of common basis or grounds for post-award GAO protests. Next slide, please. Too often, after a lot of consternation and consideration, contractors call their legal counsel with their decision that they want to protest a contract award, only to find out that the time for requesting a debrief, or even worse yet, filing the protest has already passed. In a separate webinar entitled Post-Award Bid Protest, we talked about the expedited and very mechanical filing deadlines and other pitfalls associated with filing your bid protest. We walked through a recommended proactive bid protesting planning process, and we talked about how you might want to tailor that to the way that your company actually works. In other words, the gate reviews and capture milestones and fitting in your proactive protest planning into that system. Having a plan makes the whole process more efficient. It increases the quality and effectiveness of both your company's protests and any intervention that you may use or have to protect incumbent projects. Having a plan also enhances the cost-effective management of both your internal and your external resources. The capture plan that you have on the slide is an industry standard color gate review that's publicly available from Shipley Associates. It's recommended that your analysis is based on your own capture plan, but I included this as an example of this concept of gate reviews and fitting your protest planning into your normally scheduled gate reviews. Next slide. So we're going to switch gears and talk about what are the grounds of GAO protests. This is a much abbreviated version of a training that I provide subject to the gate review analysis and proactive planning for bid protests. And this training would be geared towards your contract managers, proposal managers, and leaders. Armed with the analysis performed during your protest planning process, this kind of training will assist the entire team in analyzing solicitations and debriefing materials and trying to figure out if a protest is viable. The crux of this whole protest process is really fundamental fairness. And in line with GAO, it's found that a fundamental principle of any competitive procurement is that competitors must be treated fairly. And fairness in competitions for federal procurements is largely defined by the evaluation that's reasonable and consistent with the terms of the solicitation. So that's really what the whole protest process is all about. Overall, the GAO will not reevaluate technical proposals. Instead, it'll examine the way that the agency evaluated those proposals to ensure that the evaluation and the whole process was reasonable and consistent with the solicitation's stated evaluation criteria with procurement statutes and regulations. So as part of your analysis and your proactive planning then, some of the questions you might ask, just as samples, are, was the technical evaluation of the bidders similar, or was it dissimilar? Was one bidder favored over the other, for example? Or was the evaluation reasonable and consistent with the terms laid out in the solicitation? Did the agency waive a material requirement of the solicitation for the awardee? So that really goes to, was that awardee treated dissimilarly? And then the final example is, did the agency mechanically apply characteristics to the government estimate evaluation? So adding on to that concept, I have a brief discussion of a couple of recent cases. In one, the GAO found that the report made it clear the source selection decision was based on a purely mechanical application of the numerical scores for the technical factors in price. The GAO also noted that the contract officer award memorandum contains not even a hint as to the basis of the scoring of the proposal and provided no assessment of strengths and weaknesses. GAO concluded that where a price technical trade-off is made, the source selection decision must be documented, and documentation must include the rationale for trade-offs, including the benefits associated with any additional costs and price. So this technical flaw evaluation of mechanical evaluation is a pretty common area that is explored, and you'll see it if you keep up with the cases coming out. It's a pretty common ground. A second example is a second case, York Building Services, where the SSO, the source selection official, appeared to have relied on point scores in a very mechanical fashion when it concluded that the proposals were technically equal, and then it simply awarded to the lowest bidder. The GAO found that that was unreasonable because point scores should merely be used as a guide to quote-unquote intelligent decision-making, and their proximity does not itself establish technical equality. One other ground that I didn't include on the slide that falls into this technical flawed evaluation is unduly restrictive solicitations. This one I didn't include it on the slide because it typically comes up in pre-award protests, but it may also only become apparent as a post-award matter. And under that, with the Competition and Contracting Act, often referred to as CICA, it requires that solicitations permit full and open competition and contain restrictive provisions only to the extent necessary to satisfy the needs of the agency. In other words, in a nutshell, the more competition, the better, because obviously the government will hopefully, I should say, get the best price and the best technical solution. GAO found that where a protester challenges the application of a solicitation provision as being unduly restrictive, the agency must establish that the provision is reasonably necessary to satisfy the agency's needs. The agency's justification must be rational and withstand logical scrutiny. So a really simple example of this ground would be a requirement that workers in a logistics contract have to be able to lift 100 pounds over their head when, based on the description of work, there's no reasonable associated requirement. That's just a simple explanation of that one. The next slide. The next technical evaluation flaw that we're going to look at that could possibly be the basis of a protest is technical evaluation that deviates from the stated solicitation criteria. Questions that you would be asking yourself is, did the agency make a source selection decision based on the criteria or premises that are different than what's included in the solicitation? Was the source selection dependent on an unstated requirement or criteria? Was the evaluation factor applied that's not expressly included in the solicitation? So a factor that's over and above, or a changed definition. We see that quite a bit. Did the agency apply improper weighting? An agency must disclose the significant factors of evaluation and weight applied to each significant factor or subfactor. So just running through a couple of quick examples. In a recent case, the GAO sustained the protest because the apparent awardee proposed an individual as a key personnel position using a really high-level statement that the individual had the related supervisory work experience. However, nowhere in the resume did it include an explanation of the specific work experience that was expressly required by the solicitation. And as a result, the GAO felt that the award decision was based on criteria that was different than that was required by the solicitation. A second example is one with dissimilar treatment in evaluation. In that case, the SSO found that 2 of the awardee strengths were a significant program benefit, but then it failed to explain why it did not also find similar strength proposed by the protester to be a significant benefit to the agency. So, simply stated, for a very similar strength, the awardee received credit and the protester did not. So the bidders were improperly treated unequally and dissimilarly. And all of these, I hope you're starting to see, they go to the initial basis of this process, which is fairness. The next slide, please. The next grounds or potential grounds of protest that we commonly see revolve around the concepts of discussions and clarifications. Errors made in clarifications or discussions are common, and they often confuse clients because there's 2 different standards. Clarifications are just limited exchanges that agencies routinely use to allow offerors to clarify certain aspects of their proposals or to resolve minor or clerical issues. Discussions, on the other hand, they occur when the agency communicates with the offeror for the purpose of obtaining information that's essential to determine the acceptability of the proposal or the quotation, or provides the offeror with the opportunity to revise or modify its proposal. So let's look at some cases again. Based on recent cases, GAO has found that it is a fundamental principle of negotiated procurement that discussions, when they're conducted, must be meaningful. That is, discussions must identify deficiencies and significant weaknesses in the offeror's proposal that could reasonably be addressed so as to materially enhance the offeror's potential for receiving an award. An agency may not, through silence, mislead an offeror into responding in a way that does not address the agency's concern or otherwise misinform the offeror concerning a problem with its proposal or the government's requirements. So in looking at the things that we might want to look at in determining whether we want or we're able to file a protest, we would ask, were the discussions held with any or all of the offerors? Did the solicitation require discussions or clarifications? Were the discussions meaningful or were they misleading? Did the government insinuate the price was too high, and then when you submitted your best and final, the government disqualified you because they didn't think that your proposal was realistic? In other words, it was too low. That's the kind of thing that that would not hold witness and certainly would be a grounds for protest. Did the government point out all the significant weaknesses, a flaw that increases the risk of unsuccessful performance, for example, and deficiencies, a material failure to meet a government requirement? Next slide. So, cost realism evaluation flaws. This slide and the next 2 slides, I selected these grounds because clients get confused about these similar terms, and so we're going to walk through them. They're really simple to understand. A cost reimbursement contract performed requires cost realism analysis. Cost realism is basically looking at, is the cost unreasonably low so that the contractor may not be able to actually perform? Adding a bit of color here, looking at some recent cases again, the GAO found that it will look at 3 major factors. 1, whether the proposed costs are realistic for the work to be performed. 2, whether they reflect a clear understanding of the requirements. And 3, if proposed costs are consistent with the unique methods of performance and materials described in the offeror's technical proposal. Agencies are required to perform these analyses when awarding cost reimbursement contracts to determine the probable cost of performance for each offeror. So they're supposed to look at the offeror's proposal and the solution that the offeror proposes. Agencies are given broad discretion to make cost realism evaluations. An agency is not required to do a CLIN-by-CLIN basis or an item-by-item assessment, but rather they should do an overall evaluation and exercise informed judgment about the agents. Summing all this up in a nutshell, GAO's review of the agency's cost realism evaluation is going to be limited to determining whether the cost analysis was reasonable and not arbitrary. So in our analysis, what kind of questions should we be asking? We go back to the slide with the sample questions. Did the government perform a cost realism analysis at all? Was the cost realism analysis reasonably based, or was it just arbitrary? Did the government fail to adjust cost elements that it determined were unrealistic? Were the errors, including mathematical errors, included in the cost evaluation? And we've seen quite a few times mathematical errors, especially in those proposals that have cumbersome and huge inflated Excel spreadsheets where, you know, there's millions of cells that have to be filled in. It's quite easy to get a mathematical error. So that's one of the areas that a lot of contractors kind of hone in on. Next slide. Price realism flaws. In a firm fixed price opportunity, the government has discretion of performing price realism as opposed to cost realism analysis. And the analysis are going to be similar to what we talked about with cost realism. It's just the difference of looking at cost versus price. Again, in this particular case, we want to look very closely at sections L, which is instructions and conditions, and section M of your RFP, evaluation factors for award, to see what the government was required to do, and then we take a look at did they actually do what they said they were going to do, or what they were required to do is a better way of saying that. We're going to, for the interest of time, slip over to the next slide. Price reasonableness evaluation flaws. So now we're going to look at what's the difference between a reasonable analysis and a realism analysis, and they're basically flipped. And this is where clients typically get the two terms confused. Prior to awarding a firm fixed price contract, the government must make a determination that the price is fair and reasonable. So in other words, the price is not too high. So in our realism analysis we were looking at, is the price too low? And in this particular case, the government is looking at, is the price too high? In some cases, price competition alone, because there's enough competitors, may be sufficient to establish price reasonableness, but we need to take a check and double check at our sections L and M and throughout the proposal to see if additional price reasonableness evaluations are supposed to have been done. Next slide, please. So this is, we're getting close, I think, to the end of our presentation. This is going to be our last slide, but this is quite possibly the most important slide. There are two grounds of potential protest in this slide. One is documentation, and the other is competitive prejudice. So a source selection or award is unreasonable where the record does not provide proper documentation or explanation that supports the price technical trade-off. And so when you think about your GAO protest, the agency must produce its record and report, and the council will have to go through that to make a determination as to whether documentation is accurate and adequate. That may be, in some cases, an added ground of protest once the protest is already filed. But in other cases, we can see that documentation is not adequate through the debriefing materials and questions asked during the debriefing. So adding a little bit of color here with some cases. The GAO found that regarding an agency's selection determination, an agency is required to have adequate documentation to support each evaluation of the proposal and the selection decision. GAO found that adjectival ratings and point scores are useful as guides to decision making, but they generally are not controlling. Instead, they have to be supported by documentation of the differences between the proposals, and that includes an assessment of their strengths, weaknesses, risks, and the basis and the reason for the selection decision. Timing of documentation on the government's part is also crucial. GAO has found that where an agency offers an explanation of its evaluation during the heat of litigation that's not borne out by contemporaneous record, which means that it was captured at the time that the decision was happening or the evaluation was happening, the GAO will generally give very little weight to the later explanation. In a second case, the GAO found that the protest would be sustained in part because the agency failed to contemporaneously document how the awardee's weaknesses and risks were resolved, including those associated
All right, Rose, thank you for joining us today. This is going to be recorded and posted on our website and YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please contact her directly with the email you see on your screen. This concludes the webinar. Thank you, everybody.